February 19, 1945. 9 a.m. The Pacific Ocean, 2 miles off the coast of Iwo Jima. Corporal James Buchanan pressed his back against the steel wall of the Higgins boat and listened to the sound of the world ending around him. Above him, the 16-inch guns of American battleships were firing in continuous salvos, each shell weighing as much as a small automobile, each detonation visible as a flash of orange light against the grey February sky. Ahead of him, somewhere beyond the steel ramp that would drop in a few minutes, was an island that American planners had been bombing continuously for 72 days. 8 square miles of volcanic rock. No fresh water. No civilian population. No strategic value except one. It sat halfway between the Mariana Islands, where American B-29 bombers were based, and the Japanese home islands, where those bombers needed to go. Iwo Jima had airfields. Whoever controlled those airfields controlled where the crippled American bombers returning from Japan had somewhere to land or ditched in the ocean with their crews. The American High Command had calculated that taking Iwo Jima would require 5 days. They had assigned 3 Marine divisions to the assault, approximately 70,000 men, the largest force of Marines ever assembled for a single operation. The pre-landing bombardment had been the longest and heaviest in the Pacific War. Intelligence estimates suggested the island's garrison of 21,000 Japanese soldiers had been reduced to a fraction of that number by 72 days of air and naval bombardment. Every one of those estimates was wrong. What Corporal Buchanan and 29,999 other Marines were about to discover when that steel ramp dropped was that Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent 8 months building something that American military planners had never encountered and could not have adequately prepared for. Not a conventional defensive line. Not a series of beach fortifications. An entire underground city. 18 miles of tunnels. Hundreds of interconnected bunkers and firing positions. Artillery pieces mounted on railroad tracks that could be rolled forward to fire and back into the rock before counter-battery fire could find them. Concrete walls 5 feet thick that had absorbed 72 days of the heaviest bombardment in Pacific War history and emerged essentially intact. A defensive system so thoroughly integrated with the island's volcanic terrain that American bombs and shells that missed direct hits accomplished almost nothing. Kuribayashi had done something else that no Japanese commander had done before him. He had forbidden his men to die in banzai charges. The suicidal frontal attacks that had characterized Japanese defensive tactics throughout the Pacific campaign, the charges that had cost Japan enormous casualties while achieving almost nothing militarily, were prohibited. His men would fight from their tunnels and bunkers. They would make the Americans pay for every yard. They would kill as many Marines as possible before dying themselves. And they would not die easily. The Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima had been told by their commanders and believed with complete conviction that they were going to die on that island. The question was not whether they would die, but how many Americans they would take with them. Kuribayashi had calculated that if each of his 21,000 men killed 10 Americans before dying, the cost to the United States would be so catastrophic that the American public would demand a negotiated peace rather than the invasion of the Japanese home islands. It was, in its brutal logic, not an unreasonable calculation. The Higgins boat ramp dropped at 9:02 a.m. The first wave of Marines hit the beach and immediately discovered why Iwo Jima was going to be unlike anything that had come before. The volcanic ash that covered the island's beaches was nothing like the sand of Pacific Islands Marines had assaulted previously. It was black and coarse, and it shifted underfoot like ball bearings. Men who tried to run found themselves sinking ankle-deep with every step. Vehicles that rolled off landing craft immediately bogged down. The carefully planned assault that was supposed to move rapidly inland stalled at the water's edge as thousands of Marines struggled through the volcanic ash under fire that had not yet begun. Kuribayashi had planned it precisely this way. He had ordered his men to hold their fire until the beaches were packed. He wanted Americans on the beach, unable to move quickly, crowded together, before he revealed what he had built. At 9:44 a.m., 42 minutes after the first wave landed, the island opened up. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, and rifle fire erupted simultaneously from positions that the pre-landing bombardment had failed to destroy, from tunnels and bunkers that were invisible from the air and from the sea, from firing positions that covered every inch of the beach from multiple angles. Marines who had been moving inland through the volcanic ash found themselves caught in crossfire from positions they couldn't see. The beach that had seemed quiet became a killing ground in minutes. First Lieutenant John Wells of the 27th Marines described it in his after-action report with the clinical precision of a man who had processed horror into documentation. The fire came from everywhere and nowhere. You would identify a position, direct fire on it, silence it, and 30 seconds later fire would come from the same location. They were connected underground. You couldn't suppress them because suppressing one position just meant the man inside moved to a different firing point and waited. The casualties in the first hours were staggering. By noon on February 19th, the Marines had suffered 2,400 casualties. By the end of the first day, that number had risen to over 2,500. The 5-day operation that American planners had projected was already revealing itself as something far longer and far more costly than anyone in the American command had been willing to publicly acknowledge. What the American command knew, and what the Marines fighting their way off the beach discovered through brutal experience, was that taking Iwo Jima required a solution that American military doctrine had never fully developed. There was no way to suppress the Japanese defensive positions from the air or from the sea because the positions were inside the rock. There was no way to flank them because the island was 8 square miles and completely surrounded by ocean. There was no way to wait them out because B-29 crews were dying over Japan every day that Iwo Jima remained in Japanese hands. The only way to take Iwo Jima was to go into the tunnels and the bunkers and the caves and kill every Japanese soldier inside them. One position at a time. One tunnel at a time. 1 yard at a time. The Marines did it. The battle for Iwo Jima's beaches lasted 4 days of fighting so intense that veterans of Guadalcanal and Palau, men who thought they understood what close combat in the Pacific meant, described Iwo Jima as something categorically different. The volcanic terrain provided no cover except the craters left by American bombs and shells. Moving from one crater to the next meant crossing open ground under fire. Attacking a Japanese bunker meant approaching a position from which the defenders could fire in multiple directions simultaneously, supported by tunnel connections to adjacent positions that allowed them to reinforce or withdraw and return through a different entrance. The weapon that made it possible to take those positions was the M2 flamethrower, a device that projected burning napalm into tunnel entrances and bunker openings and denied Japanese defenders the ability to simply wait inside their fortifications for the Marines to pass. Flamethrower operators became the most important men on the island and also the most dangerous job in the Pacific War. Japanese defenders learned to identify flamethrower operators and direct concentrated fire at them. The life expectancy of a flamethrower operator at Iwo Jima was measured in minutes of active combat. Private First Class Hershel Williams, 21 years old, from Quiet Dell, West Virginia, spent 4 hours on February 23 moving through Japanese defensive positions with his flamethrower while his fellow Marines provided covering fire. He attacked one bunker after another, returning to American lines to refuel his flamethrower multiple times, going back into the fire each time, destroying position after position until the advance that had been stalled for hours began moving again. Williams survived. He received the Medal of Honor. When asked later what he had been thinking during those 4 hours, he said he had been thinking about the next position and whether he had enough fuel. That is what Iwo Jima asked of its Marines, and that is what they gave it. Not heroism as it is described in speeches, grand and conscious and aware of its own significance, but heroism as it actually exists in combat, small and focused and utterly concerned with the immediate problem in front of you. On the morning of February 23rd, 4 days into the battle, a patrol from the 28th Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi, the extinct volcano that dominated the southern end of the island and from whose slopes Japanese observers had been directing fire onto the beaches. The patrol had fought its way up the mountain through tunnel complexes and cave positions over 4 days of combat. When they reached the summit, they raised a small American flag on a piece of pipe. The men on the beaches below who saw that flag went silent first and then erupted. Ships' horns sounded across the fleet. Men who had been fighting for 4 days with almost no sleep stood up in their positions and cheered. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, observing from a ship offshore, turned to Marine General Holland Smith and said the raising of that flag meant that the Marine Corps would have a place in American history for the next 500 years. A few hours later, a larger flag was brought up to replace the first. The moment it was raised was captured by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal. The photograph he took in that instant, 6 men raising a flag against a grey Pacific sky, became the most reproduced photograph in history, the image that defined not just Iwo Jima but the entire American experience of the Second World War. 3 of the 6 men in that photograph were killed on Iwo Jima before the battle ended. The island was declared secured on March 26th. The 5 days had become 36. The fighting that filled those 36 days between the flag raising on Suribachi and the declaration of the island as secured was some of the most brutal sustained combat in American military history. After the beaches were taken and Suribachi was secured, The Marines turned north toward the main Japanese defensive complex that Kuribayashi had built in the Rocky Highlands called the Motoyama Plateau. If the beach fighting had been terrible, the fighting in the north was something beyond that. The terrain was a nightmare of ridges, ravines, and rock formations that provided natural fortification for the tunnel system beneath. American tanks, which had been critical to the advance across the beaches, found the Rocky Highland terrain nearly impassable. Artillery support, which had been devastating in open terrain, was less effective against positions dug into solid rock. The Marines moved through it anyway. The advance was measured in yards. Each ridge taken revealed another ridge behind it. Each complex of bunkers and tunnels cleared revealed another complex beyond. The Japanese defenders, following Kuribayashi's orders, fought from their positions until they were physically incapable of fighting and then fought some more. American commanders who had fought in the Pacific since Guadalcanal reported that they had never seen Japanese defenders fight with such discipline and such complete absence of the suicidal charges that had previously characterized their tactics. Sergeant John Basilone had already received the Medal of Honor for his actions at Guadalcanal, where he had manned machine guns alone for hours against a Japanese assault that had killed most of his unit. He had been brought back to the United States as a hero, used for war bond tours, offered a position training recruits that would have kept him safely away from combat for the rest of the war. He had turned it down and requested a combat assignment. He landed on Iwo Jima on February 19th with the first wave. He was killed on the beach that morning, leading his men through Japanese fire toward a bunker complex that was pinning down the advance. Basilone's story was repeated in different forms across the island throughout those 36 days. Men who could have been somewhere else were not somewhere else. Men who had already proven themselves beyond any reasonable doubt went back to prove it again because there was a job that needed doing and they were the ones who could do it. The cost was enormous. By the time the island was declared secured, the Marines had suffered 26,000 casualties, including nearly 7,000 killed. It was the only battle in the Pacific War where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest died in their tunnels and their bunkers and their cave positions, fighting to the last as Kuribayashi had ordered, killing Americans at every opportunity until they had nothing left to kill with. Kuribayashi himself was never found. His last radio message to Japanese headquarters, sent on March 17th, 9 days before the island was declared secured, reported that his men had fought with everything they had and that he was about to lead the last of them in a final attack. He praised his soldiers and apologized to the emperor for his failure. He was never heard from again. His body was never positively identified. The cost to Japan went beyond the 21,000 men who died on Iwo Jima. Those men included some of the most experienced officers and NCOs in the Japanese army, men whose tactical skill and ability to train and lead soldiers was irreplaceable at a stage of the war when Japan's ability to replace losses of any kind had been severely degraded. The tunnel system that Kuribayashi had built, the system that had made the American campaign so costly, had also sealed the fate of the men inside it. They had nowhere to go. What Iwo Jima gave the United States was worth every one of those 26,000 casualties, as brutal as it is to write that sentence. In the final months of the war, more than 2,400 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima. Each of those aircraft carried a crew of 11 men. The arithmetic is simple and devastating. The island that cost 7,000 Marines their lives saved the lives of more than 26,000 airmen who would otherwise have died when their crippled bombers went into the Pacific. The men who landed on Iwo Jima on February 19th, 1945 did not know they were saving 26,000 lives. They knew they were doing a job that needed doing, on an island that smelled of sulfur and offered no cover and no mercy, against an enemy that had built an entire civilization underground for the purpose of killing them. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of all American naval forces in the Pacific, wrote the epitaph for Iwo Jima in a communique that has become one of the most quoted sentences in American military history. Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. He was right. In 36 days of fighting on 8 square miles of volcanic rock, the United States Marine Corps earned 27 Medals of Honor. That is more Medals of Honor in a single battle than any other engagement in American history. 27 men whose actions were judged to have exceeded every standard of courage and sacrifice that the United States government could formally recognize. And behind those 27 were tens of thousands more whose actions were no less courageous, but whose specific moments of valor happened without a witness position to submit the necessary paperwork. The Marines who survived Iwo Jima carried it inside them for the rest of their lives in the way that people carry things that are too large to be processed and set aside. Veterans of other Pacific battles who encountered Iwo Jima survivors described a quality in those men that was different from anything else they had seen, a stillness, a weight, a knowledge of something about human endurance and human darkness that most people never encounter and that could not be communicated to anyone who hadn't been there. Private First Class William Parker, interviewed in 1985 at a reunion of Iwo Jima veterans, was asked what he wanted people to understand about the battle. He was quiet for a long time before answering. "I want them to understand that it was real," he said. "Not like in the movies. Not heroic in the way people mean when they use that word. It was just men doing what had to be done, one step at a time, because the alternative was letting down the man next to you. That's all it was. That's everything it was." The island of Iwo Jima was returned to Japan in 1968. It is now called Iwo II, its original Japanese name. The airfields that cost 7,000 Marines their lives are overgrown. The tunnels that Kuribayashi built are still there, miles of them, sealed now, running through the volcanic rock in darkness. Every year, veterans of both sides return to the island for a ceremony of reconciliation. American Marines and Japanese veterans who fought against each other in 1945 stand together on the black volcanic sand and acknowledge what happened there and what it cost and what it meant. At one of those ceremonies, a Japanese veteran named Tsurugi Akikusa, who had been 19 years old when he fought on Iwo Jima and was one of the 216 Japanese soldiers taken prisoner, was asked what he thought of the Americans who had defeated him. He said, "They were the best soldiers I ever saw. They kept coming no matter what we did. We killed them and they kept coming. We had built everything to stop them and they came through it anyway. After the war, I understood why. They believed in something worth fighting for. That made them impossible to stop." The flag that was raised on Mount Suribachi on February 23, 1945 is at the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Virginia. The photograph Joe Rosenthal took of its raising has been reproduced more times than any other photograph in history. It became the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, the bronze figures forever frozen in the act of raising that flag against the Pacific sky. But the real monument to Iwo Jima is not in Virginia. It is in the 26,000 American airmen who landed on that island in their crippled bombers and walked away from crashes that would have killed them in the ocean. It is in their children and grandchildren who exist because those men lived. It is in every subsequent generation of Americans who inherited a world shaped by the outcome of a war that was decided in part by what happened on 8 square miles of volcanic rock in the Western Pacific over 36 days in the winter and spring of 1945. The Marines who took Iwo Jima did not do it for monuments or photographs or the gratitude of future generations. They did it because it was their job, and because the man next to them needed them to do it, and because they were United States Marines and that was what United States Marines did. Uncommon valor was a common virtue. It still is.